Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We've got an icebreaker for you today. Anybody who was at our last one knows we like an icebreaker. So feel free to vote as you're coming in. You can thank Michael Shellhouse for these, although I do like a Star Trek reference. Was glad to see it. Welcome, everyone. We're probably going to get started in about 1.5 minutes. We got a lot to cover today, so I want to make sure we get to all of it. And hopefully to time for questions. Hi, Amy. We've got the Q&A open, but we do not have the chat open. So feel free to submit questions through the Q&A. Oh, I gotta turn my video on. Hello, everyone. Michael, I had to look up Buck Rogers in the 25th century. I had not heard of this. I had not heard
And
of
now you're
this.
just making me feel old.
First of all,
And I know I'm not that old.
I'm older than you. Maybe I was watching My Little Pony instead. I don't know.
I had to have the full spectrum of super old to most recent.
We all ended up in the same place though, didn't we? All right, I'm gonna give it 30 seconds, then we're gonna jump in. Um, let's uh let's see the results of the poll at 12:05 and then we'll get started. Ooh, okay. Okay. All right, we got a lot of love for Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Love it, love it, love it. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I am Rebecca Gwilt. I am a digital health attorney, startup mentor, angel investor, and co-founder and partner at Nixon Gwilt Law. We're a boutique practice in the US where we help digital health and healthcare technology companies navigate corporate, commercial, regulatory, and reimbursement law and policy to help our clients build great businesses. I am joined by my colleagues Michael Shellhouse and Sam Pinson. We are 3 of 4 at the firm's AI practice, and we are on the second of a 4-part series for that's aimed at helping digital health companies make sense of the fast-paced, fast-growing, fast-moving AI policy and law landscape. I'm going to hand it over to Michael and Sam to introduce themselves. Just quick, just a quick housekeeping. Make sure you stay to the end because we're going to have some key takeaways and we're going to be talking about sort of topics for the next webinar. Also, we will be accepting questions in the Q&A if you would like to submit them and fielding them during the webinar, but we will also have collect them and make sure if we don't get to all of them that we will respond to them post webinar. Go ahead and introduce yourselves, Michael and Sam.
Thanks, Rebecca. As Rebecca said, I'm counsel here at Nixon Gwilt Law. I'm part of the AI practice that we have here. One of the areas of my specialties, one of my areas of specialty and expertise is FDA regulation of emerging technologies and medical devices. And as we see, that's one of the areas here with AI and machine-enabled medical devices. And it's a very fast-moving area, so we're excited to be able to talk to you about that today.
Yep, and I'll close us out here. Sam Pinson, counsel with Nixon Gwilt Law, focused on corporate and regulatory matters as related to the intersection of AI and healthcare.
All right, let's do it. First, quick disclaimer, we can get this out of the way. While I am a lawyer, I am not your lawyer, unless you've signed an engagement agreement with the firm. This presentation is for educational purposes only.
Great.
All right,
So
I'll take it away.
Yeah, so before we get started, wanted to level set and kind of walk through some of the key questions that we hope to address by the end of this webinar. It's a spectrum of questions designed to help developers and deployers, enter the market with some actionable insights. We're going to cover a range of topics, from whether the FDA will regulate your AI-powered digital health tool and whether you can avoid FDA scrutiny. We're also going to walk through how the FDA determines an AI tool's classification, and to that end, which of the 2 or 3 kind of main buckets a lot of these tools fit into, one of which is non-device clinical decision support. The other is non-device subject to enforcement discretion. And we're going to, cover a lot of these topics in more detail as we go through the webinar. And lastly, looking at how the FDA looks at generative AI tools as opposed to kind of your traditional algorithmic, AI solutions and all of the nuances in between. Next slide. So it wouldn't be, an FDA AI webinar if we didn't walk through some of the key terms. The first of which, of course, is AI. And it's worth noting that, AI is not AI is not AI. There are a lot of kind of nuances and distinctions between different AI technologies. Today, that means a lot of different things. It could be generative AI for text generation. It could be algorithmic AI for image analysis, a whole gamut of applications. What powers that could be machine learning or generative AI. Neural networks, kind of all the different key terms that comprise AI. So it's, a pretty broad landscape of applications that we're going to cover today. From an FDA perspective, we kind of created a big 3, what, who, and how, to kind of capture our, interpretation and designation for some of these AI technologies. What is the intended use? That is the general purpose of the device or its function. That can be anything from a diagnosis tool, note summarization, image analysis, all the way down the line. Indications for use is the who. This describes the disease or condition that the device will diagnose or treat, and also gets at the patient population for which the device is intended, whether that's a high-risk group with chronic conditions or otherwise. And then lastly is the how, and this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. It's how you accomplish the what and for the who. From FDA's perspective, this includes some key questions such as how the data inputs are being captured, what data is being analyzed, essentially is how the device is going to accomplish its intended use. We can go to the next slide. To kind of, ground this presentation in terms of what's going on in the market right now, we thought it'd be helpful to provide a quick survey of FDA regulated devices. Those that have been cleared as of May 2024. And I will note that, of course, the space is moving very quickly. So these figures are current as of the dates listed. AI is certainly not new. We have almost 900 devices that have been cleared. But what is new is sort of the proliferation of generative AI solutions. Looks like we have a poll question for the audience to answer. But so current approvals are kind of focused on locked algorithms. That is that they do not continuously learn after they've been deployed. So we've had 0 continuous learning algorithms cleared as of July of last year. And we have yet to see a generative AI device cleared, as of January of this year. So this goes back to the, definition of AI, how diverse it is, and then also the function by function approach that the FDA takes to device and product regulation broadly.
Yeah, we can leave this poll up through the next 2 slides.
Okay. So we have, wanted to take a deeper dive into what the market looks like today from an AI perspective. Most of the AI devices that have been approved as of today are geared towards radiology, and that is, image analysis is a really popular modality. But I think the chart here really demonstrates the breadth of specialty use cases, right? You can imagine AI solutions entering into each of these practices that we have below, but today radiology is really taking the lead. and all of these intended uses go towards kind of the what, the who, and the how that I went through before, right? The features of the product are going to be very distinct. The patient population and the diagnoses that the tool is intended to be deployed towards is very important. And then the same is true for implementation and monitoring throughout the kind of surveillance period of a device being launched. And time will tell whether generative AI use cases pick up some steam in the primary care and specialty setting, but we do expect to see growth across the practice areas listed below.
One thing we'll point out here on the slide as well is if you see that main spike with radiology, one of the reasons that we see this is as AI started to be cleared by the FDA, radiology was really one of the only areas that it focused in primarily at the beginning. As we see these other areas start to come out, we see there's, as Sam said, this huge breadth of new areas where AI is starting to emerge. Now, that's emerging very quickly in these new areas, and so we're starting to see traction there, but it's still very new in new areas. So it's encouraging to see that it's expanding into new areas that we haven't seen before. We still see that large spike in radiology, but we're seeing a lot of new applications of AI, which is exciting.
Hey, Michael, we have a question in the poll from Andrea. She said she can't see anything. She doesn't see Alzheimer's on the survey of AI-enabled devices, and assuming it's part of neurology. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, this is by panel by the FDA, and so anything relating to Alzheimer's or mental states or anything like that would be lumped into those panels by the FDA. So these aren't particular conditions or anything like that, but just how the FDA categorizes kind of which group a device will be viewed by the FDA panels.
Thank you both. So kind of last survey here before we get into, the mechanics of some of the applicable FDA regulations. We wanted to show, how these AI products that have been approved get to market. The majority of which, as of May of this year, have gone through the 510(k) pathway. And that makes sense, right? Because there's a lower barrier to entry with the 510(k). You tag alongside an existing predicate device with similar functions that's already been cleared by the FDA. Which, of course, leads to a quicker go-to-market kind of timeline from an FDA perspective. Only 22 FDA-approved AI devices have gone through the de novo process. This is a much higher barrier to entry. What this essentially means is that there's no comparable predicate device in the market. You may need additional clinical and non-clinical data to support the claims throughout the filing process with FDA. And then a point I want to emphasize is that these figures don't cover all the devices or non-devices that are in the market that are outside of the purview of FDA regulation, right? So those that are clinical decision support or enforcement discretion, those that pose significantly low risk that they don't fall into either of these two pathways. We can go to the next slide.
I'd love to see the results of the poll if we can. I didn't get to vote. Okay, so it looks like about half are interested in sort of clinical decision support. Does that surprise you, Michael? It does not surprise me.
That does not surprise me at all. So I think you'll be interested in part of what we're going to discuss next or soon.
Yes. My guess, Sam, if you voted, it would be Gen AI, yeah?
Yes, if I had to.
Every day and twice on Sunday?
Yes, that's right.
All right, very, very interesting.
We can go to the next slide. So last kind of level setting piece of the presentation here, we're going to kind of walk through some of the common questions for AI regulation in specific, taking a narrower look at the FDA's approach. The first of which is, does the FDA have a separate pathway for AI devices? That is those that are outside of the scope of software as a medical device, and whether that framework, even covers artificial intelligence solutions. Michael and Rebecca are going to, go through the details of that as we progress here. The second question, walking through whether the FDA will look at AI applications different from other healthcare applications, those that already exist, right, that are in the software as a medical device or hardware medical device setting. And then lastly, and perhaps most important to the audience here, is if I do have an AI-enabled tool in the healthcare field, do I need a specific AI analysis? from an FDA perspective for my tool. And that may come in the form of a legal assessment or otherwise from a software as a medical device perspective. And that's, these are kind of the three core components of the FDA presentation today.
Yeah, and I'll note that there's sort of like a ghost question here, which is like the question that doesn't get answered. We have a lot of clients that will say, well, we know X, Y, and Z is operating in the marketplace and doing this right now. They're not FDA cleared. They don't have to do anything around FDA. There are many clients where we do a demo of their technology and we're the first people to say, have you thought about FDA implications of your tool? There's a lot of folks out there that don't even know they should be thinking about this, right? We're just developing a mobile app. We're just integrating this new technology, et cetera. So kudos to all of you who are here to figure out whether and if this applies to you, but there's still an enormous amount of activity in the marketplace among companies who are not aware that they even need to be asking these questions.
So what we're going to do is let's actually go back to that last slide, Rebecca.
Yeah.
As we dive into the details of what regulatory pathways exist for AI devices, we're going to start off with quick answers to these common questions. And then we'll look at what those quick answers mean for different AI devices. Looking at these common questions, does the FDA have a specific separate regulatory pathway for AI devices? The quick answer simply is no. AI devices, from an FDA perspective, are treated the same as any other software device coming to market. The second question with that, though, is will the FDA look at those devices differently? The answer there is yes. So even though the FDA doesn't have a separate regulatory pathway, they are going to look at AI-enabled applications and devices differently. The reason for that is FDA takes a risk-based approach to software regulation in medical devices. AI-enabled devices do present or have the potential to present unique risks to patients within the clinical workflow. And so FDA is aware of that, and they're going to look at what those unique risks may be. So even though there isn't a separate regulatory pathway, AI developers and deployers of AI-enabled devices within the healthcare field do need to be aware of what the risks are inherent to your AI-enabled device and be able to address those with FDA, because the FDA is definitely going to look at those. The questions of how you're addressing those risks and how you're mitigating those risks is largely going to determine what FDA regulatory pathways may be available to you. And that leads into that third question of, do I need to do a specific FDA analysis for my tool in order to determine what regulatory pathway is applicable to me? The answer there is yes. The reason for that is that going back to those big three that we have, the what are you doing, who are you doing it for, and most importantly, how are you doing it? Those really come down to the nuts and bolts of the details regarding the specifics of your particular AI-enabled tool. Whether you fit into one regulatory pathway or another comes down to the details. And you're not going to know what those details are and what the risks are with one AI-enabled device versus another AI-enabled device without really digging into those details. And so we're going to look at what some of those details are and what regulatory pathways are enabled for them going into the next slides. So in general, there are three main regulatory buckets that an AI-enabled product or device may fall into. The first is just that it may be classified as not a medical device at all. The second is it may be classified as a device under the FDA's enforcement discretion. And third, it may be classified as a device under active regulation. So the first one, not a device, these are going to be products that are outside the FDA's regulatory discretion. Devices that are under FDA's enforcement discretion, these are devices that the FDA recognizes are medical devices, but they present a sufficiently low risk to patients that the FDA is not going to actively enforce any of the normal regulations for devices that we find under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The third one, active regulation, these are devices that will be subject to all of the normal regulatory requirements under the FD&C Act. So those regulatory requirements under the FD&C Act are the things that we normally think of when we think of medical devices. This includes your pre-market notification process, either a 510K, a pre-market approval or a PMA, or that de novo process that Sam was talking about previously. This also includes all of the device registration and listing requirements and compliance with your normal registration and regulations, things such as quality system requirements, good manufacturing practices, records and reporting, labeling requirements, regulations for device adulteration or misbranding, banned devices or restricted devices, notification, repair, replacement, and refund. So all of those are what we consider as your normal general controls that are going to be applicable to any device that's under active regulation. We do also want to note that the FDA looks at software devices, including AI and machine learning enabled devices, on a function by function basis. So what you'll often see in a product is a software product coming to market will often have a mix of functions that fall into these different categories. In other words, you may have certain functions within your product that qualify as not a device function, some that may qualify for the FDA's enforcement discretion, and some that will fall under active regulation. An overall product is likely going to be regulated at the highest level of regulation that the functions fall under. So if you have functions within an AI-enabled product that would require active regulation and some functions that don't, the overall AI product is going to require active regulation. So it's important to know exactly where your risks are, what your levers are, and what your red flags are within your overall AI product. Next slide. So we're going to look at each of these three buckets and kind of look at what are the main red flags and where you may fall with your different products. The first one is not a device. Within the 21st Century Cures Act that we see passed at the end of 2016, we have 5 groups of software functions that are excluded from the device definition. These are administrative support tools, general wellness products, electronic patient records, medical device data systems, and non-device clinical decision support. We want to highlight that non-device portion, and we'll come back to that in a second. Of these 5, the big 3 for AI-enabled products are administrative support tools, general wellness products, and that non-device CDS. Administrative support tools are fairly straightforward. These are tools that are intended to provide non-clinical support. Things like scheduling appointments with patients, providing billing support, and things of a non-clinical nature. General wellness products are a little bit more complicated, but they're still fairly straightforward. These are products that are intended for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle, but are unrelated to diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, or treatment of a disease or condition. In other words, these are things that are intended to either help patients self-manage a condition or treatment without providing treatment recommendations or treatment suggestions. It's important that the FDA does recognize that certain low-risk products may start pushing into the device area, but if they are low risk, the FDA doesn't intend to actively regulate them, even though they may be pushing the line into that device area if they're considered low-risk general wellness products. If you're looking at an AI-enabled product within this area, there are some limitations on it. And again, that goes down to the type of recommendations or support that the device is providing in terms of, is it general or is it specific to a patient? With AI-enabled products, the limit here is whether an AI-enabled product is providing patient-specific analysis and recommendations, or if it's generalized based on widely accepted information for general wellness and treatment recommendations that may promote healthy lifestyles versus patient-specific analysis. We know that AI-enabled tools really have a benefit for patient-specific customized treatment recommendations for their particular situation. That's going to be pushing the line for general wellness products, and so you want to be very careful about the details of what type of analysis is occurring there to fit into that area. For non-device clinical decision support, this is really one that we want to focus on because it's a big one in the industry. Next slide. So for non-device clinical decision support tools, the term clinical decision support, or CDS, is broadly used throughout the healthcare industry in a variety of ways to describe a wide variety of tools intended to support clinical decision-making and clinicians. However, from a regulatory perspective, the term CDS has a very specific meaning that's different from the way it's used within the industry. This has led to, I think, a wide misunderstanding between what it means to be CDS and the regulatory implications of that. What we often hear is, if I'm CDS, I don't need to worry about the FDA or regulatory requirements for medical devices. And the fact is that's not true. From an FDA perspective, there are 2 types of clinical decision support software systems. One is non-device CDS, which is exempt from the device definition and is therefore exempt from FDA regulations and the regulatory requirements for devices. The second type of CDS is device CDS, which will be actively regulated by the FDA in the same way as other software devices. It's very important for any type of AI-enabled tool that's looking to go to market under this definition of clinical decision support to clearly understand whether they fall into the non-device CDS category or whether they're going to be determined by the FDA to be a device CDS. That determination is going to really spell out whether you're going to be actively regulated by the FDA or not. In September of 2022, FDA provided very clear guidance on what an AI-enabled device or other software platform needs to do to be eligible to fall into that non-device CDS pathway. And what they provided for us is 4 specific criteria that must be met in order to qualify as non-device CDS, which will be exempt from the device definition and FDA regulation. Those 4 criteria really speak to 4 different things. The first criteria speaks to what type of data you can't process. This includes medical images, signals, or patterns. For AI-enabled products, this is a significant limitation because we know that AI-enabled products really have a particular strength in taking massive amounts of data from signals or patterns and being able to process those to point out to clinicians where data needs to be examined or where the signals or patterns are showing differences. We also know that AI really is useful in performing specialized medical image analysis. It's one of the strengths of AI platforms. But if you're performing any of these types of functions, you're automatically kicked out of that non-device definition, and you're going to be actively regulated by the FDA. The second criteria speaks to what type of data you can be processing, and that includes any type of patient medical information or other medical information such as reference materials. The rule of thumb here is essentially if it's data that one clinician can pass to another clinician easily in a conversation, that's data that will likely be able to pass this criteria. The third criteria is what types of outputs or analysis can a non-device CDS software be providing to clinicians. The limitation is that an AI-enabled product can provide support or recommendations to a healthcare professional or clinician. FDA really has a focus here on the support or recommendations and does require that if an AI-enabled product is providing recommendations to a healthcare professional or clinician, that's providing multiple recommendations. A single recommendation is considered by the FDA to be a specific output or directive that is not allowed under the non-device CDS category. They're really focusing here on 2 things. One is the level of automation that is occurring, and the idea of automation bias. FDA is concerned that if the platform is providing a single specific output or directive, the clinician is going to just go along with that or be more liable to agree with it without performing an independent analysis of the data. In other words, it's going to lead the clinician to be more likely to agree with the AI-enabled software device without performing that independent review of the basis of the recommendation. FDA has also noted that in performing that specific output or directive, they're taking a very broad view of what's going to qualify as that. So they've provided the example that if an AI-enabled product provides an output to a clinician that a patient may exhibit signs of a disease, or if they provide a risk probability or risk score to a clinician, this is also going to qualify as a specific output or directive that is going to cause the AI-enabled tool to be actively regulated by the FDA and not be eligible for this non-device CDS category. The fourth criteria is level of transparency. AI-enabled tools need to provide sufficient transparency to a clinician to allow the clinician to provide that independent clinician review of the basis for why the AI-enabled tool is providing that recommendation or support. For AI-enabled tools, this can be a very difficult bar to meet, particularly if you're doing generative AI, where you can't specifically point out where the output came from or why the algorithm gave that specific output. So if you're trying to fit into this non-device CDS, you can see there are particular challenges for AI-enabled tools. One is, the level of patient analysis and the specificity of the output. Two are those challenges of transparency. So it's really important fitting into this area to dive into those details and look at what are your red flags? How can you fit into those areas? Next slide. So the second bucket is devices under FDA's enforcement discretion. These are low-risk devices that don't pose a risk to patients if the software is to malfunction. There's two main categories here. The first is software devices that help patients self-manage their disease or condition without providing specific treatment or treatment recommendations. The second one is software devices that automate simple tasks for healthcare providers. There's a lot of limitations that FDA has put onto these types of products or devices. A lot of those limitations really kind of go back to those ideas that we have with the big three. The first limitation is with patient-facing software, AI-enabled tools are not allowed to really provide outputs that are intended to give specific treatment suggestions or recommendations. This really centers yourself on the risk profile that you see with the how in our big three. The idea there is, are you providing information to a patient without the clinician involved that is supplanting the clinician's role in that patient-clinician relationship? What kind of risks is that presenting to the clinician? If it's presenting the potential for risk to the clinician's health or to the patient's health, the FDA is going to want to regulate that. In terms of automating simple tasks for healthcare providers, the limitations there are similar to what we see with a non-device CDS. It can't provide any patient-specific analysis coupled with specific outputs or directives. If your AI-enabled tool is performing any function that does something like that, it's going to kick it out of enforcement discretion, and the FDA is going to want to take a look at that to ensure that the specific outputs or directives your AI-enabled tool is providing are going to be safe and effective, and it's not going to affect the clinician's clinical decision-making sufficiently enough that it's going to pose any kind of risk to the patients in terms of the treatments and recommendations that the patient is receiving. FDA provided updated guidance for this in September of 2022, but we've seen the AI landscape has shifted dramatically since then. But the FDA has noted in their guidance that they recognize that there are a lot of new and innovative software functions, particularly with AI, that continue to evolve. And so the FDA's guidance that they've put out is not intended to be a static guidance that must be met. And FDA is very much focused on providing guidance that is intended to allow innovation within the space. And so the big takeaway under enforcement discretion is that enabled to fit under enforcement discretion, the key point to focus on is often that question of how your software is looking to accomplish the what and the who. It is very detailed analysis. And so if you're looking to fit under enforcement discretion with an AI-enabled product, you always want to focus on those details. You always want to look at what is the legal analysis of how the functions of my device are going to fit within the framework the FDA has set up, and how am I going to mitigate the risks presented by my platform. Next slide. The third bucket that we have is regular.
One second. I was going to say to everyone listening, we've got a lot of really good questions in the Q&A after this slide. I'm going to ask some of them of Michael before we move on. So we're not ignoring you. We'll get to it.
So the third bucket that we have is regulatory pathways that are actively regulated by the FDA. These are what we normally think of when we think of devices that are going to the FDA, that are going through clearance with the FDA. Again, the FDA takes a risk-based approach to these devices. Devices are classified as class 1 for low risk, class 2 for moderate risk, class 3 for high risk. Your low risk class 1 devices are going to be subject to the general controls that we talked about previously. These low risk devices are generally going to be exempt from your 510(k) clearance, but they are going to be subject to those other general controls, such as registration and listing, good manufacturing practices, quality management systems, and so forth. Your class 2 moderate risk devices, these are going to be subject to general controls, as well as special controls targeted to address any unique risks the device may present. For AI-enabled products, we are often going to see special controls targeted to unique risks that AI-enabled products may present. This may include specific performance standards, post-market surveillance, special labeling, pre-market notification data requirements, meaning that if a product needs to go through a 510(k), FDA may require special types of data requirements, data validation as part of that 510(k) process. A lot of class 2 products may be exempt from the 510(k) pre-market notification process, but we are seeing that a lot of the AI-enabled products coming to market under class 2 are going to require a 510(k). The reason for that is that the 510(k) process is intended to show that a device is substantially equivalent to another predicate device that's already on the market. The standard for substantial equivalence is that one, the device coming into the market now has the same intended use and uses the same technological characteristics as the device already on the market. Or two, it has the same intended use and it uses a different technological characteristic, but does not raise different questions of safety and effectiveness. And it can demonstrate that it is just as safe and effective as the device is already on the market. Now, as we see with innovation, the application of AI and machine learning processes to achieve similar intended uses, but in a new way, is often going to fall under that second category, where you have the same intended use, but you're using a different technological characteristic. The key question for that, and whether you can use the 510(k) under that basis, is often going to be that question of, is your utilization of AI in order to achieve this same intended use going to raise any unique or new questions of safety and effectiveness? And can your data demonstrate that your device is just as safe and effective within those same questions of safety and effectiveness? Because of that, most AI-enabled devices we see come into the market do require that 510(k). The FDA is also likely going to require additional types of data validation and data submission to the FDA in order to demonstrate that. One of the questions we often see is, if a device has to come under a 510(k), is the FDA going to require clinical data or not? We do know that they're going to require non-clinical data like software validation, human factors and testing, cybersecurity testing and validation, and all of those. Are they going to require clinical data? Well, the FDA often requires clinical data when the technological differences are significant, or when non-clinical testing methods are limited or inadequate for the FDA to be able to confirm whether the safety and effectiveness of the devices are sufficient. With AI-enabled products, we are often seeing the FDA require clinical data because the technological differences are significant from their viewpoint from the previous predicate devices that are a very different method of achieving the same intended use. That doesn't mean that clinical data is always going to be required. It is going to be a very case-by-case basis and depend on exactly what, again, going back to those big three, what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and importantly, how you're doing it. But it is something to keep in mind, and you're always going to have to look at the details. The third one here is the PMA. These are for high-risk devices that support or sustain human life or of substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health. This is really your highest level of clearance or approval by the FDA. It's going to require everything the 510(k) does, as well as in-depth scientific evidence and reasoning, non-clinical laboratory studies, as well as in-depth data on clinical investigations. The last one is the de novo classification. This kind of fits in the middle between the 510(k) and the PMA. It's going to require all the same non-clinical bench tests that you see with the 510(k). Clinical data is likely going to be required. The purpose of the de novo classification really is to point to the FDA and say that I believe that my AI-enabled device fits into this classification for these reasons. Here is all of my data showing that my device is safe and effective, and here's why. It really has a different purpose than the 510(k), and because of that, the FDA is going to require different levels of data and different types of data. So if you're going for a de novo, you need to know exactly, again, what risks your device presents, what is the what, who, and how of how your device is functioning, and be familiar with what level of data and evidence the FDA is going to require for your AI-enabled device, specifically based on the risk your device may present to patients. And Rebecca, we'll hand it to you for questions.
Are you ready?
Dive in. Yes.
All right, we got a lightning round. Yeah, so I'm gonna. These are really interesting questions. Some of them, Michael might say, "Well, this depends," and it would be a longer question. But we're going to come up on a fun little sort of pretend company exercise where we can walk through what it might look like with a real company. So hopefully that'll be informative as well. All right, you ready, Michael?
It's also a huge data dump, so I'm expecting a ton of questions as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right, here's an easy one. Can you confirm which CDS type a product is through the FDA 513G process?
You can do a 513G. 513G is really intended to get classification on what product classification code a device goes under. There's pros and cons to the 513G. It does cost money. It's also not binding on the FDA, and you may not get the answer you want. You may not get specifically for a CDS product, whether it's non-CDS or device CDS. Really, if you're looking to go for that, I generally recommend a legal analysis outside of the FDA or go for a pre-submission. Pre-submission is free, does not cost money, and you can generally get the same level of information from a 513G. It's also not binding on the FDA, but neither is a 513G, and it's usually easier to get.
Yeah, and I can imagine that getting a legal analysis in advance is a great way to like prepare for something like that, right? To have the questions posed before the FDA would pose questions like that.
Either way you go through those, you're going to need to know exactly what the details are, what your risk levels are, what your levers are, and what your red flags are in order to submit that information to the FDA. So doing that as a preliminary step may be able to answer your questions before you even have to take it to the FDA.
Okay, how do you think about a software-only device versus a device that is hardware with embedded AI software?
That's a great question. FDA is going to look at it. It's likely going to regulate it in a very similar manner. The difference is going to be whether the software is regulated independently or whether it's regulated as software in a medical device versus software as a medical device, which is just software that's integral to the operation of a physical hardware device, or if it's standalone software. The actual regulatory pathway doesn't change very much, but you do need to consider whether the software will be regulated independently or not, which changes a little bit of your analysis of what your risk levels are, and whether you need to submit and register independently or if it's considered part of the overall hardware device.
All right, can you share an example of a non-device CDS?
Yeah, so non-device CDS may be a software platform that is looking at patient data and provides recommendations to a clinician that says, based on these, a patient has XYZ blood pressure readings. Based on the criteria that you've provided to me, these reference materials may be relevant. The clinician should go look at these to make a clinical decision about what to do for the patient. So based on,
This is similar to what happens like in an EMR when something pops up and says, hey, have you thought about this? This might help your clinical decision making.
Yeah, so if you have, for example, an AI-enabled tool that is looking at a patient's medical record and says, based on widely accepted reference materials from the heart, the Heart Association or whatever, these references may be relevant. Go look at these and make a decision about the patient. Something like that would probably be non-clinical decision support software. The key factors there are that it's not making patient-specific analysis with one output. It's providing options or referring the clinician to widely accepted reference materials for the clinician to make an independent decision.
Okay, as the use of AI expands across specialties and we're seeing different types of AI emerge, do you anticipate the FDA slowing down its approval process?
That is a great question. That is going to depend on if we see more submissions. FDA has limited resources and limited staff, right? So as we see more submissions, they are inundated with applications. So we may see it slow down just because they have limited capacity to go through. FDA is doing everything they can to get through their submissions as quickly as possible. This kind of goes back to your question of a 513G. Actual applications for 510Ks, PMAs, de novos get priority. So if you submit a 513G, you're probably going to see a significant delay before you get an answer. If you do a pre-sub, you're generally going to get an answer faster. If you do an informal email to the FDA, you may get an answer faster. But we are currently seeing delays in approvals and clearances simply because FDA does not have the staff to go through everything they get. So fingers crossed, hopefully they get an increase in budget to bring in more staff to do it. But that's really outside of FDA's control itself. We'll look at Congress and see what they do with their budget, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, ask Congress. Yeah.
Ask Congress.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So there's a couple more questions, but I want to get through the presentation. So we're going to move on. But hopefully we'll have some time at the end.
Okay.
Anything we want to say about this one?
What I just wanted to highlight here is we see kind of a timeline of the FDA's focus on really pushing innovation with providing guidance. We see in 2017, they provided information on specifically one of the key questions is, if I submit or create an AI-enabled device, a lot of AI devices, like one of the key strengths of it is being able to change it over time. At what point does a change in an AI-enabled device going to require resubmission of a 510(k)? FDA has provided guidance on that. This came out in 2017, but still holds, and there are guidelines on when changes to a software product, including AI-enabled devices, is going to require resubmission. So any questions about that, FDA has provided guidance. We do see in 2021, they have an action plan that just highlights what their long-term goals are to foster innovation in the AI space. 2021, we also see good machine learning practices. 2023 was a huge win for AI with the predetermined change control plan that allows AI-enabled devices to receive pre-approval for planned changes that will occur in the future. Or in other words, you can receive clearance right now for your device, AI-enabled device. As part of that approval, you can get pre-approval for changes that you plan to make in the future. This allows for staged improvements of your AI-enabled device over time without having to resubmit every time, as long as you've gotten pre-approval for those. There's requirements and limitations on that, but just know that's a huge win for AI. March of 2024, we see FDA showing we're still focusing on this. We have uniformity across the different branches of the FDA, the different groups, saying how they're working together to try to unify their approach to AI. And just last week, we see this massive guidance from FDA on transparency requirements and recommendations for AI and machine learning enabled medical devices. This is a very important one I just want to highlight. This is one of the most in-depth guidances the FDA has provided on what they're requiring and expecting on transparency for AI-enabled machine learning devices. So if you haven't looked at this one, definitely go take a look.
All right, with 10 minutes to go, we're gonna have to shorten our exercise a little bit, but I grew up in musical theater and I never miss a chance to play a role. So today I'm playing the role of founder and CEO of company Vitamend. Vitamend is a pioneering company in the food as medicine industry, leveraging advanced AI technology to personalize nutrition plans. Our AI can analyze eye images to determine if cilantro will taste like soap, potentially aiding in customized nutrition advice. The primary functionality of the product is to detect cilantro taste preference. Secondary functionality that we're looking into would be to identify shellfish allergies also from scanning the eye. And again, the applications are nutrition planning and potentially detecting life-threatening allergies in children. We haven't decided between selling directly to consumers or through nutritionists and dietitians. We're considering both direct to consumer and B2B. We want to make sure that we're compliant with FDA regulation for our AI-based product. We'd like to know if it's a medical device or maybe it's just general wellness, and a little bit more about what we need to be aware of. So Michael, as our counsel, how should we approach the classification of our AI product under the current FDA guidelines?
Well, first off, I want to say kudos. You've identified your primary functionality, your second functionality. So you've identified one of those big three right off the bat of what you want to do. That's great. You've also identified kind of what some of your focus and targets are with your who. So as you go into your ideation, you've got that intentional design down. You know what your intended use are and your indications for use are. So one of the big questions that you're going to have is, what is the regulatory pathway that you want to aim for? One of the
cheapest one. I'm going to do the cheapest and the fastest one.
The cheapest and fastest one. So as you look at regulatory pathways, the fastest path to market, as we look at it, is one, not a device or non-device CDS. Being able to go to market without having to go through the active regulation of the FDA is always going to allow you to get to market faster, to start building revenue and building a customer base. The question for your device, for any AI-enabled device, is, can you have a functionality that's going to allow you to do that? That goes to that third big three, the implementation and how you're doing what you're doing. So the questions that we would need to look at with your product is, what are you doing? And do you have functionality that's going to push you out of one of those two categories of not a device or device under enforcement discretion and is going to require that you go to FDA to get clearance before you can go to market.
So if the output of my device is a yes or no answer about whether cilantro tastes like soap or not, for my dietitian to make delicious meals recommendations for her patients, that seems like fairly low risk. Would that be a device?
One of the questions we also need to answer with that is whether it's a device is, are you intending this to be part of the dietitian's treatment plan for the patient? Or is this just intended as a general wellness to make the food taste better just because you want it to taste better? So talk me through a little bit of that. Is
Yeah.
this part of the medical purpose of it? Or is this just part of, we want food to taste good because food that tastes good is great?
Well, ideally, we'd like to figure out how to get this paid for by insurers, but maybe for right now, we'd just like to get it in the market and sort of gaining traction. So is there a way that we could build like a first version that would avoid the FDA, and then when we want to move into the healthcare space a little more, then maybe add functionality later?
Absolutely. So one of the things we often see with tools is this staged approach to market entrance. FDA takes a risk-based approach, and that's done on a function-by-function basis. So if we develop a first version of your product with a limited functionality that is intended for either non-medical purposes that could potentially fit under one of our non-device categories, or a medical purpose with a super low risk intended use that may fit under our enforcement discretion category, you can go to market without having to clear with the FDA. But again, it's going to depend on the details, and we want to make sure that we have limited functionality in order to fit into those.
So
Then
you
once
would
you're in the market, you can develop that more fulsome functionality that may require FDA clearance.
So like when you say the details, you mean like exactly what the output is of our device? What details are important for you to know to be able to make the determination?
So the details there are going to be what type of data you're collecting, how you're collecting it, how you're analyzing it, and how you're presenting it to clinicians and what you're presenting to clinicians.
Okay.
So it's going to be the whole spectrum, right?
Okay. And less risky if we present it to clinicians as opposed to consumers.
Absolutely. Anytime you're presenting data directly to consumers, that increases the risk profile, increases the probability that you're going to be actively regulated by the FDA, as opposed to presenting to clinicians. It's a different risk profile. You're able to provide different functionality to clinicians than you are to patients.
And the use case for the taste of cilantro versus the use case for potentially identifying allergies in children, would the FDA look at those the same way?
Absolutely. As you pointed out, the use case for taste of cilantro is likely a non-medical use case. That's either general wellness or just we want food to taste good, right? Non-medical purpose. Identifying allergies in children, you're looking at a vulnerable population with a potentially time sensitive, especially if we're looking at, depending on the severity of the allergy, it may be a time sensitive issue if it presents a risk to the patient or the child's health or life. That's a high risk situation that is likely going to require a much higher risk profile that could affect whether the FDA is going to regulate you or not.
Okay. Okay, thank you, and take a bow. All right, so let's move on to the key takeaways, and then maybe we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Oops.
Yeah, I can jump in here on key takeaways. So, we covered a lot of ground here, but importantly, when you center it around the big three of what, who, and how, it can really kind of inform your legal and commercial strategy as you go to market, and also kind of mitigate risk throughout that entire process. Importantly, know your risks and plan your path. One of the big things that we see from clients is kind of an over-reliance on CDS, and CDS does not automatically mean that you are exempt per se from FDA regulation. And then perhaps most importantly is, as we're going through the development process, do not build technology in a vacuum. In a high-risk area where patient care is involved, it's always important to build with intent and take very, deliberate steps, both from a technology perspective and a legal perspective to, ensure that you are leveraging the right FDA pathways appropriately.
Awesome. Okay, let's put up the final poll. I just want to tease for everyone, we're going to have our next webinar on how to prepare to sell your AI-powered digital health product to institutional buyers. But we are in the midst of planning our our presentation after that. So I'd love to hear from this group what else would be interesting to you for us to talk about. We try to make our presentations really substantive to teach you as much as we can about the topic. If there's anything else we don't get to or didn't answer today, feel free to reach out to us. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. The link here should be accessible. Oops, here we go. Actually, I can't click on it. So I'm going to drop the link to our newsletter in the chat. And you can find any of us on LinkedIn. We've also prepared a one-pager with the key takeaways for what you need to know about assessing your regulatory risk as an AI-powered digital health device, software as a medical device. You will receive this in an email after the webinar, along with a recording of the email, recording of the webinar. You can share that with colleagues if you like. Let me see if we can get to a couple more questions in the 2 minutes that we have. Let's see. Looking at an established med tech company like Boston Scientific or Abbott, do their first AI devices need to go through de novo certification if they're designed to work with and improve established products? Tricky one.
So that's going to depend on what those products are for. If they're intended for a medical purpose, then you're likely going to want to look at whether that needs FDA clearance or what regulatory path it may fall into. If it's not intended for a medical purpose, that may shift the analysis, right? FDA's primary focus is always patient safety and effectiveness. And so if a device is intended to fall into that area of being used in a medical sense or a medical purpose, that's always where you want to look for your red flags and whether FDA is going to regulate.
Okay, all right, we have time for one more question. Where would automated clinical documentation support fall if the clinical documentation support tool does not make recommendations? It's a specific.
I'm assuming by automated clinical documentation support, we're referring to something that automates like the transcription of clinical documentation or something like that.
That's my assumption as well.
That really is going to depend.
Or they pull data from the medical record or something like that and summarize it in a SOAP note or something like that.
Yeah, it's likely going to depend on a lot of the details of how you're doing that. Really, it's going to come down to the question of, within the context of what regulatory pathway you're going to fall into, whether the FDA considers that a specific output or directive. One of the things we often see FDA concerned about is if an AI-enabled tool is providing a specific output to the clinician, even if the clinician is reviewing it, the level of automation is a trigger point and a risk point FDA is concerned about and wants to take a look at. So if you're trying to fall into a lower risk category, like non-device CDS or enforcement discretion or something like that, the level of automation that's occurring is something FDA is kind of concerned about. Even if the clinician is involved in reviewing it, you want to look at the details of the level of automation. And that's kind of the best I can give without additional information. So you kind of want to look at the details of it.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Michael and Sam. If you need to get in touch with us, you'll have our emails. They'll go out with the post-webinar presentation. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. Take care.